Hi, my name is Alex Yackery. I'm the co-founder of Venture Solar based in Brooklyn, New York. The industry news this week is all surrounding the Trump administration's decision regarding the international trade case on imported solar cells and modules. So we wanted to provide some context as to what this means for the industry going forward. The solar tariff started with a complaint from a company called Suniva, a US-based solar manufacturer whose majority owned by a Chinese corporation, and was shortly thereafter joined by SolarWorld, another US-based manufacturer who's owned by a German company, and these two companies asked the Trump administration to increase the barriers to foreign imports of solar cells and solar modules. The recommendation of the Trade Commission was to add tariffs, and fortunately the Trump administration chose a less severe action than the recommendation, which starts with a 30% tariff on imported solar cells and modules this year and will decline by 5% over the next 3 years. The silver lining is that the first 2.5 gigawatts of imports will be exempt from the tariff, and that will represent about 20 to 25% of the annual US solar demand. So as a solar company, we obviously don't agree with the tariff. From our perspective, there's over 250,000 jobs directly tied to the US solar industry, many of which are on the installation, sales, marketing, operations side of the business, not the manufacturing business. And the reality of this tariff is it's really not enough to kickstart domestic manufacturing. It's really just enough to slow the growth of solar. So Green Tech Media has adjusted their forecast for the US solar market down 11% versus expectations, which is still around 60 gigawatts installed over the next 5 years, which is a tremendous amount of solar. But it's unfortunate to see that the Trump administration's actions regarding this tariff will slow the growth of what is our inevitable way of powering the world. The solar industry as a whole has experienced tremendous growth over the last several years. And in fact, in 2017, over 25% of the new electricity generation that's been brought online is from solar, which is great. The unfortunate reality of today is the Trump administration has not been the most solar-friendly administration we've had. So in addition to the tariff, which we certainly expect to slow growth, more so in the utility segment and the commercial segment, we don't anticipate this really having any effect here at Venture Solar and on the residential sector as a whole. But in addition to that, we have the tax reform policy, which is in some ways a double-edged sword, as it does reduce the tax burden on corporations, but that also lowers the demand for tax equity in the market as a whole, which is a large component when financing a solar project. So all that being said, we think the future of solar is still very bright. There's a long way to go here in the US in all segments, and this is simply a small speed bump that we will see in the macro trends, but there will still be millions more people, businesses, who will choose to go solar. The bright side of the tariff, no pun intended, is really two-part. One, we now have certainty. Prior to the decision, it was very difficult for developers to not only procure panels due to companies and utility scale projects getting pushed forward, but also what prices would be in the future. So now that we know, it's much easier to continue to develop projects with certainty as to what pricing will be. The other component is that the Trump administration's decision, although not solar friendly, was less severe than some of the recommendations that were made by the Trade Commission. When you look at the cost of a solar project, the module itself doesn't comprise the majority and the cell comprises even less. So we think that there may be ways to navigate, there may be certain technologies that are exempt, and the reality is this is going to have a very marginal effect on pricing, if any at all. The market reaction now that the Trump administration has made their decision is that this really isn't as big of a deal as the news is making it sound. So I think we'll continue to see articles about doom and gloom and the blow to the solar industry, but the reality is the forecasts are still for growth in the industry as a whole, just slightly slower growth due to the tariff that's been enacted. And we'll have to see what the World Trade Organization has to say. There is some precedence for these being overturned. It'll also be interesting to see what solar manufacturers, both abroad and domestically, do as the tariff is on imports, and that could be at the cell level or the module. So some companies may choose to start assembling modules in the US and simply importing the cells, which would imply a much lower added cost because the cell itself is significantly less expensive than the entire module. To give some context as to what this really means, the cost of a solar panel only makes up a relatively small percentage of the cost of a project. So this is simply a tax on one small piece of the puzzle. The solar industry has found many efficiencies over the last several years, mostly in the cost of installation and the soft costs associated with the project. This would be like if your daily cup of coffee went from $3.50 to $3.58. You wouldn't stop buying that cup of coffee. Where the effects may be felt is more so on the slowed growth or lack of job creation, people who would have been paying taxes, money that would have been invested into U.S. solar projects. So it's certainly not a death blow. It's certainly not the worst news that we could have gotten. And we're excited to see continued growth in our company here in New York and in the industry as a whole.